Really, I'm so grateful to be here. Kimber is one of my closest allies and colleagues, and have nothing but extraordinary respect for her in every dimension of her life, the organization she's built her here in Arizona, the businesses, and I'm hoping to get her back east in late September to work on a fledgling economic venture we've got going there as well. But what I'm going to do today in about 35 minutes, I hope, I'll try to aim for that so we have plenty of time for conversation, is to first ground the discussion of local food systems and building an alternative food system in the broader kind of cultural, but especially economic context that we've got. So I'm going to start with this. The yellow bar was the population of the United States in 1980. The year Ronald Reagan won his first term. And then 36 years later, in 2016, it had grown from, that's 230 million to 320 million, a modest growth. During that exact same period, that's how much the US economy grew in real dollar terms, inflation adjusted terms. Again, population grew like that. The economy more than or nearly tripled in size. So if you have a population that's grown by about 40% and a population that's nearly 3 times bigger, that means 3 times more transactions, money being made, the big question is, where did it all go? Why aren't the vast majority of us all over this country much better off? Because the gross domestic product per person has increased dramatically during that period of time. So, well, why is that? What's happened? Well, one is explained by this graph. The top line, the purple line, is worker productivity, a simple but important measurement that economists use. It's the amount of output that a worker produces in a day, let's say. It can be in a factory, it could be on a farm, it could be in a retail establishment. It's the output, the worker output. The other 2 lines are different ways of measuring wages. One of them is median household, the other one is hourly wage. Historically, as worker productivity increased, so did wages. Because if a person can produce what it used to take 2 people to produce 10 years earlier, they make a little more. They never get the whole share, but they make a little more. But starting around the mid-70s, that relationship of increased productivity means increased wages became less and less clear. In fact, what you can see is that over most of the last 4 decades, the relationship is all but severed. So we are much more productive, but the workers ain't getting the money. Where's it going? Well, we know the answer to that, to the top end of the income spectrum. So much so that, as Oxfam pointed out in a recent study, the wealthiest 8 people on the planet now control the equivalent wealth of half of humanity, 8 people. So we see this concentration, which is particularly acute in the United States, but is also an international phenomenon. So the first issue when we're talking about food systems is that trickle down don't. The idea that when we free up a tiny class of job creators, basically people who run large corporations, people who invest in the large corporations and the wealthiest people, when we free them up with lower taxes and with easier burden on regulations and whatnot, wealth and prosperity will trickle down. Well, it don't. And it hasn't. Not since that theory was first given voice in the early 80s. So that's problem number 1. Here's another problem when we look at this. This is much better for the economy as we measure it than this. So again, smoking and eating way too much has better economic impacts than gardening and eating a modest amount of healthy food. And that's because the way we measure the economy is all driven by our belief in growth. That growth is essential and growth is the necessary ingredient towards widely shared prosperity. We measure that through the gross domestic product, the GDP. But unfortunately, the GDP doesn't just measure productive activities, it measures activities that make us sick. And in fact, going back to our smoker, if you smoke, Every time you buy a pack of cigarettes, you contribute a tiny bit to the GDP. But if you do it long enough, if you become a regular and you do 2-3 packs a day for 20, 25 years, you'll become a spectacular contributor to the economy when you end up in the emergency room with long-term chronic care, with the medications and the intensive treatment that you require to stay alive. All of that is good for the economy. So what that says to us is that we've built a way of thinking about the economy in which real costs are externalized from the costs of goods in many cases. So when farmers are pushed to farm land that is erodible or is fragile in some way because the price they're getting for their corn, their wheat, or their tomatoes, or the beef cattle is so low, most then have little choice but to externalize some of the costs in many ways, including the loss of topsoil, which then goes down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. We see it in my home area of Appalachia with the cost of cheap energy being, among other things, mountaintop removal, coal mining, and the extraordinary real cost that it has. But again, as far as the economy is concerned, we're contributing when we blow the top of the mountains off, and then we're contributing again when 25 years later, the feds are talking about investing in reclaimed mine land and putting people to work. That's a good thing. We're glad they're finally talking about reclaiming this old strip mine land and putting people to work in the process. But in a purely economic sense, we shouldn't have included that cost from the beginning. One of the things that makes this kind of economy possible, in which we divorce real productive economic activity from the way we measurement, and we externalize costs, is what Wendell Berry calls estrangement. So for those of us who are not vegetarians, if we stop at Hardee's and get a sausage biscuit, more than likely, probably about 98% chance, it comes from pigs that are raised in those conditions. Those are externalized costs, but because we're estranged from it, there's a lot of room between us and the origin of the food. The intolerable becomes acceptable. And this estrangement we see in this graph here, as a USDA economist did it about 20 years ago, in which he said, well, where does our money go when we spend $1 on food? And he broke it into 3 categories. The bottom, the beige part, is the portion that goes towards the farmer's inputs: feed, fertilizer, hay, fencing, diesel fuel, whatever. The middle, the red part, is what the farmer actually gets of the food dollar. And then the part that keeps getting bigger and bigger is everything else: the processing, the packaging, the distribution. What the local food movement has helped to do is call attention to just how the farmer's share keeps getting smaller and smaller, and most of the food dollar has nothing to do with farming. Also, the local food movement has tried to capture some of that processing, distribution, and aggregation, which is a good thing. So again, among the consequences of this estrangement is the low wages that farmers make and farm workers. Lucas Benitez, who started the Coalition for Immokalee Farm Workers, I met him about a little more than a decade ago, and he told the story of how farm workers in the Florida fields were making a penny a pound for the tomatoes they picked, which, if you do the math on that, that means for every ton, you get 20 bucks. And we've got a fair number of tomato plants on our farm, but a really, really big day, we might pick half a ton to 1,500 pounds. That's a lot of work. Think about if you have to pick 2.5, 3 tons a day just to make 50 bucks. That's what estrangement does. And estrangement also then creates this myth of cheap food, which has, among other things, helped us to go through the 30-year-long process of supersizing our portions, so that we can consume gigantic amounts because it all seems quite affordable. But it really isn't affordable, because what's been happening is that as the cost of our food, the red line, has been declining as a share of our income, the cost of treating our illnesses, the blue line, has been growing steadily and has replaced food as a much bigger part of it. Now, I'm saying all this as context for a discussion about food, local food systems, and food and farm financing, because we don't operate in a vacuum. And especially in this day when the local food movement has kind of caught hold, it's more in the mainstream, or beginning to be, than it was 20 some years ago. And as a result, we've got to take stock of the fact that we're part of this system. So when we're setting up a farmer's market or a CSA, or we're working on aggregation, and we're talking to the folks at ASU or anything else about buying local food, and we're trying to persuade local people to buy more from local farmers, we've got to remember that we live in a time where for decades now, income has been concentrating into a smaller and smaller group, which means that ordinary people, most of our customers, middle class and working folks, have not seen a wage increase in over a generation for the most part. So with that stagnant income and that low wealth, people are obviously more concerned about how they spend their money. And so it makes the argument for buying local that much harder. So building a fair and sustainable food system is more difficult when the economy as a whole and the political context around it is not supportive. So we're sick. Our politics, our public debate, Lord, is that sick, and much of the biosphere. The question is, can some alternative strategy that includes the food system but is bigger, what I call bottom-up economics, can it help? Can it help build a more just and sustainable economy that can then enable a more just and sustainable food system? So I'm going to suggest 4 different dimensions, or 4 different kind of strategies that we can look at as a way to build this bottom-up economy and healthier food system. I'll say that this is not exactly how it's organized in the book, but the book covers a lot of similar ground if you're interested. So the first strategy is building local capacity. There's a lot of different things that we can do with that. The idea of more resilient, more self-reliant communities. Community gardens are all over the country now, all over the world. In Detroit, with vast amounts of vacant urban lots, they've really embraced urban farming and community gardening, with over 1,800 community gardens in that city. Guys, people like Will Allen, some of you I'm sure know Will Allen of Growing Power, who's one of the first people to create one of these very, very contained systems of nutrient recycling, what's now commonly called aquaponics, integrating the raising of fish with intensive raising of herbs and vegetables, doing it all in very small spaces that contributes to more productive, resilient communities. La Montanita, not too far from you all, just an extraordinary co-op that started out with a handful of families in somebody's basement once a month, has grown to a member-owned cooperative with 17,000 members, with over 400 farmers who sell in and through La Montanita, with 6 retail storefronts, and their own, as you see here, cooperative distribution system. They even have now their own loan fund, reutilizing the capital that their members contribute to help people get started or expand their farming operation. Just an extraordinary idea. And then this notion that when you have a focus on building local capacity, you begin to look not at wealth as financial wealth, but wealth as real wealth, as we did in Southwest Virginia, where we were facing a lot of clear cutting and high grading of our forests. And so we built an integrated system where we selected the logs very carefully, managed the forest very well, but then sawed them into boards, kiln dried them, and turned them into hardwood flooring. Another very important part of building local capacity begins with our soils. And when I was driving over this morning with Jose, you have very, very different soil types here than we have back east. But nevertheless, wherever you are, this is the fundamental capital, this ecological capital. So a little picture from one of my fields on my farm, that whole idea that real wealth begins with natural wealth, with natural capital, whether you are recycling nutrients, whether you're building soil's capacity to absorb carbon and put it to good use. Another form of this capacity building is something that was started in Colorado, the Clean Energy Collective, now in actually 10 states, in which they grappled with the issue of solar energy and the fact that for a lot of people, for various reasons, rooftop solar doesn't always work. It might be that your building isn't pitched the right way or angled the right way, but it can also be that you're a renter and you don't have any say over whether or not the landlord's going to put panels. They created community solar gardens in which multiple families, in this case the first one, about 20 households came together. They picked the best spot near the community for solar, so they would maximize that. They were able to buy and install the panels for about 20% less because it was all done at once in bulk. And then they were able to buy in at whatever level worked for them. So if somebody wanted to buy 30 panels and fully offset their electric use, they could. If another person of more modest means could only buy 2 or 3 panels, fine. This idea of a collective approach to our energy grid, very good way to build local capacity. And the last example of this capacity building is a really interesting one from rural New Hampshire. I don't know about you all, but back in Appalachia, we have a lot of trailer parks. And generally speaking, they're considered to be kind of trash. People are not really treated as if they're human beings in a neighborhood. One of those trailer parks in rural New Hampshire, a few years back, Marjorie Kelly tells this story in her wonderful book. They owned their trailers, they owned their mobile homes, but not the land on which they sat. And so a developer came in and said, you got to get out, move your homes, because I'm selling this to somebody who's got some money. So the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund instead put together a package, enabled those folks to buy the land on which their home sat, but also gave them a little more money in those loans so they could then fix them up, add porches, and make improvements, and a trailer park became a community, a neighborhood. And as a result of the great success of that, the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund now has a whole portfolio of manufactured home loan funds. Again, building local wealth and capacity. Second strategy, going back to Wendell's comment, we need to overcome estrangement. And there's economic, political, and cultural dimensions to this. Maggie Thatcher, who came into office shortly before Ronald Reagan, she sort of spoke to this idea of rugged individualism when she said there's no such thing as a society. There's just people and families. That's it. And that helped to hasten a process that we're deeply in right now, which is this tension between our individual rights and liberties on the one hand and our obligations to our community and our neighbors. We've come down very heavily, most of us, on the side of individualism. So how do we overcome that estrangement from one another and from the biosphere? Well, farmers markets certainly are one way we're doing that. Besides being places to sell stuff, they've become places of civic engagement, which is great. It's wonderful. Our little market in Abingdon, it's a town of 8,000 people in southwestern Virginia. We started in a bad parking lot. We built up the vendors. We built up the customer base. The town let us have a better parking lot. And then after a few more years of development, they built us a little pavilion. We now have 50 vendors on Saturday morning, about 30, 35 on Tuesday afternoon. We get about 2,000 customers that come through on a Saturday morning. For a little town, that's both a good economic opportunity for farm and food vendors, but it also is wonderful because we have people lined up this time of year to buy our asparagus and broccoli. And in that line, we'll have hardcore libertarians and lefties. We'll have Glenn Beck followers and Amy Goodman listeners. We got them all right in line, and they don't relate to each other in many respects anymore. But at a farmer's market, we're kind of all in the same boat. It's really quite wonderful. Another way of overcoming estrangement was some folks in Huntington, West Virginia, southern West Virginia. They were dealing with the food desert and with the lack of opportunity for farmers to sell their stuff beyond the small market. So they reclaimed an old building, adaptive reuse, and they called it the Wild Ramp Grocery. It's a community-owned grocery store, not cooperatively, but community-owned. And this has become a way to get good, healthy local food at an affordable rate, and the farmers, about over 100, sell through it and get to keep about 75% of the value. Another way of overcoming estrangement, some very clever things happening around community theater to try to improve the public debate, to try to get us talking about tough issues. These folks in Colquitt, Georgia, started Swamp Gravy Theater over a decade ago, and they've used community theater, and everybody in the town, not everybody, but the stories come from people in the town. They're written, the plays, by people in town. The actors are the people in town. Everything except the director, who's a professional, is done, the set building, by local residents. They use it, they've used it successfully, not only to create plays that people come in to see and pay some money for, but actually to grapple with some tough issues around the racial history of the town and other things. Amazing. Very similar thing happening in Harlan, Kentucky, a group called Higher Ground, dealing with everything from the fight between strip miners and environmentalists and the opioid addiction through community theater. Just amazing, the potential for that. The idea of community media, and an organization called Apple Shop in eastern Kentucky, which has been going for almost 50 years, which is telling the stories of Appalachia, archiving the struggles and the opportunities of that area. So essential, especially now at a time when 6 corporations own 90% of the media. So community media is an essential antidote to that. And then one more example from Portland, Maine, is this idea of reclaiming public spaces. So I've been lucky to go to Italy a few times, and when you go there in the evenings, whether you're in a big city or the small town, the gathering spaces, the piazzas, just fill up with people. And even the young people put their cell phones away, and everybody's just kind of hanging together. It's quite amazing. We don't really have that in our DNA quite the same. But these folks in Portland, Maine were looking at an old park, the Congress Square Park, which once again, the town was going to sell to a private developer to put up some expensive high-rise condo type things. And the community decided, no, we don't want to give this up. So this old derelict park, they started to reclaim. People started coming organically, sweeping it and cleaning it, bringing lawn chairs, bringing in card tables, starting to do card games there. They started to get food trucks to come in and set up shop. They got one of the local businesses to let the Wi-Fi bleed over into the park, and kids started coming and doing their schoolworks and professionals on lunch. Before long, they were doing dances. They were doing World Cup soccer watching. They made this park what it was, which was a public park. They reclaimed it so that by the time the town council of Portland, Maine finally voted on whether or not to sell this to the developer, they not only nixed that, but they created a new ordinance that said any publicly owned space, for it to be sold to a private developer, 7 out of 8 council members would have to vote yes. So they made it very difficult to sell off public assets. Just an amazing, amazing story. And I would contend that without those public spaces, if most of our dialogue happens virtually, it just becomes, as we know, increasingly easy to be coarse, to be dehumanizing, and to be flat out stupid. And when you're actually interacting with other people, it's a little harder to be inhuman towards folks you see. Third strategy I'd suggest is what Wendell Berry, my guru and great, great friend, calls solving for pattern. 30 years ago, Wendell used that term. So here's what solving for pattern is not. Farmers have weeds. I struggle with weeds, got a few good systems for them, but weed control's tough. So a little more than 20 years ago, we came up with a solution to weed control. It was Roundup Ready soybeans, and then immediately after that, corn, and now many other things. Genetic resistance into the plant so that you could spray it throughout its life cycle with glyphosate or Roundup. That actually worked fairly well for a little while, but not too long, because the spraying increased so dramatically, about 500 million more pounds of herbicide sprayed since the advent of GMO crops. And that spraying hastened the development of herbicide resistance in weeds, so that now somewhere between 50 and 60% of commercial farms in this country have these so-called super weeds on them. The ag industry's primary response to that is to now breed genetic resistance into additional herbicides into those same crops, 2,4-D and others that are more potent and toxic than Roundup. Solving for pattern would be to step back and say, well, what about this pattern? What about these sets of ecological relationships might enable us to manage our weed challenges without creating new problems we hadn't anticipated? Some research and some field trials showed that people doing a corn and soybean rotation, the standard rotation through much of the middle of the country, if they simply put a grain in between the corn and soybeans, wheat, millet, barley, if they put a grain in the rotation, what happens is that the weed control is mostly organic. So herbicide use goes down by about 80%. Weed populations go down by about 85%. On top of that, the farmers have an additional crop to sell when corn or soybean prices are low, the barley, the wheat, and a benefit they hadn't expected. They interrupt the life cycle of the corn rootworm, a big problem in corn, which has led to the adoption of corn seed with neonicotinoids, those insecticides you may have heard of, the neonics so-called. Anyway, solving for pattern. They found a way to deal with weeds so that they created solutions rather than solutions creating more problems. This guy, Bren Smith, on the east coast of the US, did the same thing. He started commercial fishing when he was 15 years old, went to the east of the US, the west of the US, and Canada. Over 3 decades, he saw the fish catch declining, the fish getting smaller. He got concerned about it, and rather than continuing what he was doing, he created a system he calls vertical ocean farming, in which he raises 4 species of shellfish: oysters, clams, mussels, and scallops, in combination, vertical columns with 2 different types of seaweed. What he gets is 4 really, really healthy, marketable shellfish. He harvests the seaweed once a year, dries it. It's turned into a high protein powder for animal feed. And the seaweed, besides cleaning up the immediate environment, sequesters tremendous amounts of carbon. So he's tackling the problem of fisheries management by creating very productive systems within the pattern. In Buffalo, New York, they did a very similar thing, a group called PUSH, People United for Sustainable Housing, dealing with multiple problems: incarceration, unemployment, and a tremendous decline in the neighborhood in West Buffalo. They started this. They now have done a tremendous turnaround in this West Buffalo neighborhood, where they're putting ex-cons and other people back to work in living wage construction jobs. They're not only rehabbing the homes, they're building community parks and community urban gardens, and they're building rain gardens and other ecological filtration features. These guys who were unemployed before are now highly skilled. They're doing that in their own neighborhood. The neighborhood has been transformed, and now their skills are being sought throughout the city of Buffalo. Quite an extraordinary story. Another example of solving for patterns, what they did in Eastern Kentucky when they created an on-bill financing mechanism to help working families and low-income people do the energy retrofits they need. Many people who most need insulation and double pane windows and other things because they're spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars and emissions going in and out of their house, those people can't afford often what it would cost to make their homes warm and dry. So they created a program with the local utility in which now a private contractor goes in, does the window installation and the other improvements, and then once they finish the work, the families pay back the loan through savings on their electric bill. This is emerging now in several parts of the country. In Eastern Kentucky, it's the only one in Appalachia. And the last example I'll give is of this fellow in Radford, Virginia, not far from us, who's dealing with the question of energy efficiency and buildings by, he converted an old tire factory and he's building structurally insulated panel systems, SIPS panels, which improve your energy efficiency by 50% and are super storm worthy. Again, just a tremendous way to do that. I'm gonna skip over that. Last strategy I'd say is this idea of using the language of action rather than abstraction. We have a lot of abstract talk on the left, on the right, and in between. And I'm increasingly a believer that we need to ground our talk in real action, whatever our role is. So in southern West Virginia, where there's tremendous unemployment in the former coal industry, these folks with the Coalfield Development Corporation have created a state-of-the-art job training system that is 6 months in duration. At the end of it, like Kimber's program, virtually everybody is either able to go into business or is able to work for a business at a good wage job because they're connecting the work that they're doing with the needs of the community. And in so doing, they've created a story that's resonating with elected officials. When we started working with tobacco farmers, at the early days of our food hub, I can tell you that when I first started in the work, our pretty conservative legislators in Virginia, they just thought the whole thing of organic farming was nothing but hippie stuff. But when we got guys like John Mullins to switch over from tobacco to raising organic produce, here he is proudly holding some of his organic tomatoes while smoking a cigarette. Now, a guy like that is a great advocate for a conservative rural legislator to say, hey, maybe there's something to this local food, this sustainable farming thing. It gives a different story because it's the language of action. When Charlie Foster, one of the absolute founders and core members at our farmers market here with Doris, his sister, when they went before the town council, not in a formal setting, but just meeting the members, salt of the earth farmers like Charlie just speak a different language. In the case of Push Buffalo, just to revisit that one more time, to make the connection to policy, I told you about the tremendous work they're doing on the ground, rehabbing buildings, urban gardening, doing ecological stormwater management. What I didn't tell you was the way they got their start was they were looking at all the vacant lots in West Buffalo, which had been vacant for years, and nothing ever seemed to happen except a steady decline in those lots. So they started investigating, and they did community organizing, and they found out that the New York State Housing Finance Agency, the very agency whose mission it is to make housing affordable for ordinary people, the New York State Housing Finance Agency, instead of that, had taken all these vacant properties, had packaged them together in essentially a derivative through Bear Stearns and put them on Wall Street. The State Housing Finance Agency was earning a steady stream of revenue from Wall Street off of the neglect of properties and homes in Buffalo and other New York cities. When they found that out, they went public with it, and the end result of it was not only a scandal, but the freeing up of all that property and some income flow that allowed Push Buffalo to get its start in the sustainable housing business. So I'm going to wrap up here, and we'll move towards questions now. You know, we have a lot of issues we're grappling with, but I often like to come back to this quote from Angela Glover Blackwell, who started a group called Policy Link. And I was at, I think it might have been the Phoenix Bali conference, as a matter of fact, and she was on stage as part of a presentation, and just in passing, she said this: "We're not a poor country, and we've got to stop acting like we are." The fact of the matter is we have fantastic amounts of wealth and resources, real wealth like ecological capital, the wealth of intellectual capacity that we have, but also financial wealth. But we're not acting like it. A couple of other quick thoughts to close. So I come from a very rural area, and like many parts of Arizona, many parts where Local First works. And part of also speaking to people who are a little bit different from us is speaking in a language we can understand. And increasingly, when I talk about the environment, I talk about it as a livelihood issue. Because rural folks relate to the environment in general different from people in the urban settings in the environmental movement. The environmental movement, as it's developed, speaks mostly the language of protection. We've got to protect this land. We've got to protect this from human intervention. And that's fair enough. There's plenty of places where that's true. But rural people live in and among the trees, the forests, the lands, the streams, the creeks, the savannas, whatever it is. And to us, a chainsaw ain't such a bad thing. And so I think as we reach out to try to broaden the base for sustainable foods and perhaps for what we might call sustainability, we also need to look at reframing and understanding some of our core issues in a rural context. I'll close with this. This gentleman, Martin Miles, was the very first tobacco farmer we got to grow for our food hub. The young man with the cigarette, John Mullins, was just a little bit down the creek from him, and he started the second year. Martin is just an absolute delight. He was his whole life raising tobacco, but he was one of those people, as tobacco was in steady decline, who decided he wasn't going to give up farming, he was going to try something else. And so we came together at exactly the right time. It was his barn that we built out as our first packing shed for our food hub. People like Martin in rural areas and people of color in urban areas just aren't in the center of our debates about these issues nearly enough. Right? And so we really need to find a way that we don't just come up with our own plans and our own strategies and hope that they'll be implemented in the kinds of communities where Martin lives or other disenfranchised communities, but that they're actually in there with their wisdom, with their perspective about environment as livelihood and other things as a fundamental part of the conversation. I think that's got to be the case. That's a challenge to our whole society, but it's particularly a challenge to people like myself who would consider ourselves to be progressive people or liberal people, whatever, because too often the preoccupations and the language of us have been alienating to folks like that. So I'll stop there and we'll open it up to questions. And I think there's a mic to go around as well. Yes?
I've heard this issue of the environment as livelihood as a need for reframing a lot of these arguments and concerns. I guess I wonder if you have looked at all into how you balance how you avoid livelihood from shifting over into exploitation or destruction?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because the fact of the matter is we've kind of built an economic system which treats natural capital, which treats the ecosystem as an input that you use, and your stewardship is only to the degree of your own planning, but basically you see soil, land, water as inputs that enable you to make money. And so fundamentally we have kind of an exploitative model, right? So all livelihoods fall into that frame. The way I see it being helpful, let me start with what isn't helpful. So not to get too political on you here, but President Obama, I voted for him 2 times. He started his work on what came to be known as the Clean Power Plan early on, sort of shortly after the healthcare thing. It became his next big push. It received tremendous pushback in places like Central Appalachia. If you've read the book by Arlie Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land, about people in rural Louisiana who are unbelievably directly impacted by polluting industries, petrochemical and otherwise, who are almost all voting basically against environmental regulation. When you look at communities like Appalachia and rural Louisiana, what you realize is that too often the environmental movement has put the environment as the first step. Now, President Obama, in this last year of office, created something called the Power Plan, which is actually investing fairly significant amounts of money in Appalachia for reclaiming mine land and putting people to work, but for all kinds of innovative economic development. It's great. Imagine if he had put the Power Plan first on his agenda, because long before his environmental regulations, our communities were in serious decline. And it started investing in the kind of bottom-up economic development that was more place-based, that was more ecologically sustainable. If he had done that first and then come around to the carbon regulations and the other things subsequently, it would have been so much less alienating in places like ours and many other parts of the country. So part of it is a matter of priorities. And I think too often rural people, working people feel like their livelihood, their life is secondary to the protection of the environment. So I think it's partly, again, prioritization. The other thing, though, is that what I've found, people like Martin Miles, who'd raised tobacco his whole life, which is a chemically intensive crop. It's very extractive. It's a huge plant. When Martin was given the opportunity through the markets we had created and the support system we had to start growing organic, it kind of came out fairly early on that it really bothered him that he was spraying all these herbicides and insecticides and fungicides. It really bothered him that he saw his soil declining. And he welcomed the opportunity to be able to do something that rebuilt his soil. And as he put it once, well, I guess I'd rather grow something that people can actually eat. You know, that was his way of saying it. And so I think oftentimes people who are in the midst of extractive livelihood, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's coal, whether it's timber, logging, would rather do something else, but we haven't paid enough attention to create the market opportunities, the local infrastructure, and the other things that would enable them to do that. Got more questions over here.
I'm curious about how you started the Food Hub and what have been the keys for that success.
Yeah, I do a lot of consulting around food hubs, and usually the first thing I say is, it ain't as easy as it looks, right? So there's kind of an intuitive sensibility about food hubs that is deceptive. So it's like you have farmers, the farmers want bigger markets. You have a local food demand, people can't seem to get enough. You got the supply, you got the demand, you just put a little something in the middle and make it all happen. That's the deceptive part. It's really quite challenging. And fundamentally, the single most challenging thing, among many, the logistical elements, everything else, is the price issue. So basically, most customers of a food hub, and this is not totally true, but most customers are accustomed to buying wholesale and getting stuff a lot cheaper than most local food farmers who sell at farmers markets or CSAs are accustomed to getting for what they have. So there's a lot of issues, and I've worked with our own farmers and farmers all around the country to try to make it work, but those are the basic challenges. Now, when we started ours in 1999, going into the 2000 season, in an old tobacco barn with about a dozen mostly former tobacco farmers. And the market was ours for the taking, in essence. There wasn't a lot of competition, but it also wasn't close by. So one decision we made, because we had spent already a number of years starting the Abingdon market, starting other markets, doing local food events. We'd done that whole scene for about 6 years. And so we were very committed to local, but we realized pretty quickly that in rural Southwest Virginia, if we were going to jumpstart this, and with a food hub, you do have to get to some volume, that we were going to have to go further. So we based ours around 3 supermarket chains, one of which was local, but was kind of a buyer, okay, but not great. One of which was 100 miles away in Western North Carolina, and one of which was Whole Foods, which had a distribution center in Atlanta and Maryland that were both about 6 hours away. So we made the decision that we would have to fill up a big truck and go a little distance. Some people were saying, that's not a local transaction, that's 280 miles, but we felt that we had to do that. The other critical piece for us was, and I'm no longer, I don't run it anymore. I've been away from it for years, but I'm still aware of it. A critical piece was building the supply, because farmers in our area were accustomed to tobacco. And the wonderful thing about tobacco was when you put your seeds in the ground, you knew exactly what your quota was. You knew pretty much what the price was going to be. So whether you're growing a half an acre or 40 acres, it was all very reliable. So we've tried to emulate that by doing very careful market planning, so that when farmers say, I'm going to put out 2 acres of bell peppers or whatever their crop is, we could essentially guarantee them that we would be selling them. So it's very, very carefully orchestrated, what we call production planning. And by the way, when you're buying my book at the break, I also have a few copies of this toolkit that I wrote a few years ago, which is sort of a A to Z primer on how to start a food hub. That's if you're interested. Yes. You got a mic coming.
In this community, cotton is kind of the equitable thing to the tobacco. We have a lot of cotton farmers who are spraying. They're really locked in with Monsanto, so they can't disclose. And I'm this kind of puts this thought in my head. If we start working with the cotton farmers, somehow to convince them to make that transition, it would solve a lot of problems. And by the way, I don't know if everybody knows about Azure Standard, a 2,000 acre organic farm in Oregon. The county was going to force them to spray their weeds. Just heard this morning on my email that the county commissioner has agreed to meet with them and work out a problem a non-toxic way, because as your farm needs to use more rotation and that sort of thing to solve the problem. So hopefully we can do that with the cotton farmers. Do you have any suggestions on where to start?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So let me be really honest and say the thing about tobacco and the culture of tobacco and tobacco farmers had a lot in common with cotton and even corn and soybeans in a lot of respects, except, I mean, it did in the sense that the entire infrastructure was built around tobacco. There was tobacco warehouses where it was brought. Cooperative extension was focused on tobacco. The land grants were focused on tobacco. It was just kind of deeply built in. The difference, though, was that tobacco had this misfortune or good fortune of hitting the wall of public health. And so when we started working on creating our food hub, there was still a federal tobacco program. It wasn't subsidizing farmers, but it was assuring the sale of their product. But it was tobacco farmers' quotas were in steep decline, profitability was getting slimmer. So we had like this rare window where enough people saw that there was never going to be a rebound of the tobacco industry. And that created an openness among farmers, and eventually, later on, an openness among the support system of extension and the land grants and the state departments of ag, because there was this sort of, well, I guess tobacco will never be what it was. Most commodities, I don't know much of all about cotton, but I imagine it's the same. Most commodities have such a long history of ups and downs that, right now the corn prices might be terrible, but anybody who's farmed corn for a while knows that probably some people will get out, they'll lose their farms and the prices will go back up, etc. That makes the challenge of wooing farmers to try something different much more challenging. The second thing I'll say, and then I'll get to some good news, is that tobacco also is not terribly dissimilar from fruit and vegetable production in the equipment and the scale. You can use many crossover things, whereas people who are doing thousands of acres of commodity production have to get a whole new set of equipment, right? And it's a whole new way of doing. That said, what we found, I've worked with some folks in Kansas and Arkansas, working with some folks in Oklahoma now, is that I think what you want to do is you want to find the Martin Miles of the cotton industry, somebody who for whatever reason has some sense that maybe they could do better financially, maybe they're tired of all this spraying, maybe they're concerned about their health, maybe they know their kids don't want to farm like that. Whatever it is, somebody with some opening. You don't want to try to convert the whole bunch. You just want to find a few and then work intensively with that small group to do some trials. Maybe it's annual vegetable production, maybe it's wineries. I don't know what the crop mix is, but you work with a small kind of leading edge to show that something else is not only possible, but probably returns quite a bit more per acre with a lot less of the chemical input. That's what we did. We demonstrated it. And when people saw that Martin and a few others were having real success and making money, that's when it starts to ripple. Mm-hmm. Yep. And also don't think in terms of a single crop. That's the other thing we did. We used to have bumper stickers back in our area that said, tobacco put my kids through college. And then there was another one that would say, nothing can replace tobacco. And when you'd ask the extension agent about alternatives, they say, well, nothing can replace tobacco. Well, we've long since proven that you can make a lot more money on organic fruits and vegetables, but that thinking is pretty deeply ingrained. So you're going to have to overcome that too. Yeah.
There's also farming happening in Casa Grande right now. It's not food oriented, but it is a step in the right direction for replacing cotton because cotton takes so much water. This is the Waiuli plant. The Waiuli plant, the guy that's farming in Casa Grande, he actually has 8 patents, and it can be used to replace synthetic rubber. It's a small desert shrub that takes about a quarter of the water of cotton, and it turned out to be very profitable for him. So there are steps that are happening, it's just very slow.
And this is the best time for finding alternatives because in my lifetime at least, there's such an interest and it really does percolate into the land grants and extension and other support personnel for looking at alternatives, whether it's kind of new crops that we didn't know about or whether it's traditional heirloom crops, whatever it is, there's a real interest in that, so it's a good time.
Yeah, I think, I'm pretty sure it's, don't quote me, I don't have enough Wi-Fi to pull it. It's G-U-Y-U-L-E or something close to that. Waiuli.
Anybody else? Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. I found it very, very interesting. I'm interested in following your podcast.
Great.
My question is about, I was really interested in the graph you showed about how when a farm actually scales up, a lot of the increased cost is in that marketing department. Mm. And with the median age of farmers in this country, you know, in the 50s, 60s years old, I feel that farmers themselves probably find it very difficult to scale up in that area. And a big reason of that being just not having the know-how technically or otherwise. So my question is, do you have any like specific steps or suggestions on how farmers can close that gap? And I think you said that what the local food movement does is try to provide those resources so the farmer can do what they know how to do, you know, farming and do it well. So how can us in the local food movement really plug into helping those farmers directly, and what can farmers do to get involved?
Sure. Great. So first of all, let me clarify that graph was not a cost graph, it was a price graph. What you were looking at there was the food dollar broken into 3 categories. So it reflected what's happened over the last century when we go and spend $1 on food wherever, on average, how much of that dollar is spent on the farm inputs, how much goes into the farmer's pocket, and how much is everything else, the post-farm. So it was a price rather than a cost graph. But your point is still very valid. So again, it's going to be real different from place to place, but here's a strategy that has worked not just in Southwest Virginia relatively well, but in a lot of other communities I've worked, which is that when you think in terms of, so let's say that we'll take it as a given that everybody in this room would like to see more people farming and more people farming successfully, financially, so that they can actually make a decent living, and using organic or sustainable practices. I'll make that assumption. If anybody doesn't agree with that, well, to hell with you. And then let's say at the same time that we also recognize that there's kind of 2 groups of farmers, to simplify it a bit. There's sort of the sustainably oriented farmers who tend to be younger. More of them are women, more of them are people of color. They tend to have less experience. Some of them are brand new to farming, and they have a set of values about how to farm and the goodness of food. And then there's kind of more traditional or conventional farmers who, as a group, would tend to be older, that group you're talking about, would tend to be really good at farming, but maybe a little less open to alternatives. So if we have those 2 kind of groups, what we often say when we're trying to scale up the local food system, first of all, we think it's a mistake to focus too much on a food hub, a food aggregation distribution, as the sole solution. What we really need is we need more vibrant farmers markets where more people are making really good money on Saturday morning or Sunday afternoon, whatever it is, where they're making $1,500 and $2,000 and $3,000, not $250. We need that. We need all the other things, the La Montanitas and the wild ramps, the community-owned retail, all of that is part of it. And a food hub of aggregation and distribution we may also need at some point. To get all of that, to get to the farmer perspective, what we'll often do is, first of all, recognize that some small farmers want to stay small, and all they'll ever be good at and comfortable with is a couple of acres, all direct to consumer. And to try to persuade that person to get big is usually a mistake in my experience. It's also true at the other end of the spectrum that only a small slice of the bigger farmers, the cotton growers or commodity growers, or even a big vegetable producer, are maybe going to be open to diversifying their operation and all. But what we look for is that group in the middle. And the group in the middle is the bigger farmers who are, or the more conventional farmers who are ready to try different things, to diversify their operation, to use more sustainable practices, and the direct-to-consumer farmers, the farmers market type farmers, who for whatever reason are ready to scale up. And in that group, what we find is that the key is you help them do what they're already doing well, at least as well or better. You know, do their farmers market, do their CSA, do their online share, whatever they do well. And then have them gradually focus in on a few things they can grow very efficiently, which becomes the contribution that they make to, say, the food hub or to the larger effort. In my farm, as a for instance, we grow between 40 and 50 different kinds of items, not varieties, but 40 or 50 different kinds of fruits and vegetables for the farmer's market. And at a farmer's market, that's great because you need that diversity to keep the customers interested, right? But when we grow for our food hub, we grow just 2 or 3 things, and we grow them in quantities that we couldn't possibly sell at the farmer's market. We gain a number of efficiencies. When you have an acre of bell peppers, which ain't much, but in an acre normally on our farm, we'd have 15 different items. When you have an acre of one item that gets rotated somewhere else the next year, your planting, your management, your stringing, your picking, all of it is much more efficient. And with that efficiency, we can then sell into a food hub type market, a wholesale type market, not at rock bottom prices, but at much lower prices than we could sell at the farmer's market and still make money. So that's often what we do. We find where the farmers are at, first of all, find the ones on those 2 ends of the spectrum that are looking for something different. And then for the smaller farmers wanting to scale up, we usually work with them to identify what they would need in terms of equipment, make sure they have the market for them, whether you're providing it, and then help them figure out a production plan that focuses in on a small number of crops on a larger scale. And then they have a mix. They have a bunch of stuff they grow that they get full price for, they make a little money on, and they've got a smaller group that they grow in larger quantity at lower cost. Yes?
So thank you so much. It's very kind of replete talk. Really impressive what you presented.
Thank you.
I've been farming for about 10 years, and I'd say I've been farming well for less than that. And you know, the thing that hits me about farming here, I worked in organic farms in 8 different states, and I've been here for about, I guess I've been farming for 15 years. But it's hard to grow food here, harder than it is to grow food in other places. But you can grow it all year round. So we have there's benefits to living here because some things just grow all year round. But we don't get a break here. We don't get a planting break in the winter, I'll tell you that. The winter's full on for a certain set of crops, and then the summer is also full on for a certain set of crops. So you have to be more disciplined to take a break. But when I worked in the Northeast, it was like you took a break because all you had was what's in your cold frames and whatever. But I guess the thing that hit me is skill. How do you see, we don't talk much about failed farms in these events. We talk about success and the future of success, and we want success for everyone involved, but I don't think we assess why we fail. That's what I wanted to ask you. In your experience, you seem to be all around the country. Is it that, I mean, often it seems like the economy. I mean, we're up against people who can grow 10 times as much food as us for 10 times cheaper. And like you said, the workers don't make any money. The farmers barely make any money, and it's usually the people selling it. I don't really know who makes money other than the people who own those corporations and invest in them. It doesn't really seem like anyone's making money in industrial food. Now, small farmers, the most successful small farmers I've seen are pretty much geniuses. I mean, the people who are really good at what they do are almost in the top 1 percentile of work ethic, intelligence, ingenuity, problem solving, positivity, emotional control, health. I mean, have you seen these people? Really, really good farmers. You go there and you're like, how are you doing this? And people fail and they're in obscurity. And so that's what pains my heart, is that so many people start and fail and start and fail and start and fail. And how can we get more farmers to start and succeed and access the information of plant it in 3 rows with 3 drip tapes, use a hula hoe, buy it from this company because it's cheaper and better, and plant the seeds with this seeder because it works. Me and this guy watch YouTube all day long because we're trying to figure out how to be farmers. And we're growing 9 acres of organic produce and 30 acres of heritage wheat with a combine from 1947. And it works, but it's not easy. And we feel alone in a community of people that are too busy to connect with one another.
Right.
So I guess what I'm wondering is how do we provide security for people who are starting out? And then where have you seen examples of information hubs? So the farmer can access how to do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So that question is I'm actually now going to take the next hour to answer that question. So I'm sorry about those of you who had breakout sessions, but that one's too loaded. So a couple things real quick. First of all, the year-round thing I totally relate to. I remember when I built my first high tunnel, we had 4 high tunnels on the farm, and then the seed catalog started arriving in December and my wife was like, geez, do we ever get a break? You're opening the seed catalogs in December. Can't you just get a porn magazine instead of a seed catalog? What's the matter with you? So anyway, so I relate to the year-round thing. It's tough. But to your question, more to the point. So there is really, and this is part of why I wrote the book and part of why I do what I do on the side with these talks, is making it work at the local level has a lot of ingredients, and I'll try to touch on them as quickly as possible. One is certainly farmer skill. There's this myth, this unfortunate myth that you often hear, that the real issue is about marketing, that you grow and it's the easy part. Bull. That's bull. It's not easy at all. There's so many different problems. Now, marketing is a big issue. But the notion that, oh, there's plenty of people who know how to grow it. Yeah, there's plenty of people who know how to grow it, but grow a high percentage of number ones, know how to harvest it and keep it proper until you get it to market. I mean, there's so much to it, right? So the skill thing's important. But we also need to remember that it's all happening in a context. I didn't have the slide in here, but there's a slide that I have that shows, a couple of slides that show how USDA's subsidies go. And one of them is great. It's a pyramid. It's the old food pyramid, which is, you know, full of fruits and vegetables and then whole grains and then a little bit of meats kind of towards the top and then a tiny thing of sugar. That's how they tell us to eat. Then there's a pyramid side by side with that, which is how USDA actually spends its money, which has been improving. USDA has made some serious improvements. They have local food programs. They do organic research. All that's happening. But even with all that, the pyramid's essentially flipped, where 75% of the funding directly or indirectly goes to meats, grains and sugars, and then the vegetable part that's we're supposed to eat is this tiny, tiny little piece of the pyramid at the top. So some of it is public policy. We just have public policy that supports bigness, that supports a more extractive approach to it, and that supports a handful of commodities over everything else by far. You add up all of the local food program dollars, as much as we've improved them over the years, there's still less than a nickel on the dollar of the money that USDA spends. So that until that changes, it means that just like local businesses compared to big boxes, we're at a constant competitive disadvantage. That's one issue the context we're facing. Another one is, again, we're from a culture of cheap food. This is what we believe. And there's a bigger and bigger chunk of the population that needs cheap food because of those economic trends. But even with all that, there's still a big part of the population that wants cheap food but could spend considerably more on it. That's the real challenge. That's the person at our booth on a Saturday morning that's saying $2 for green beans, and my wife's ready to leap across the table and kill them. You know, so there's these cultural issues, which are improving as well. So there's all of that. So that context, until to the degree that we improve that context, it will make the very real challenges of small-scale farming a little less difficult, a little less risk. Procurement policies that ensure markets, food hubs that ensure markets, technical support, they all can help. Finally, to your question, I think that when I started into farming 30 plus years ago, there was essentially no resources. There wasn't an internet really to speak of, and there was no resources from the dominant institutions for organic farming. The good news now is there's tons of people who are experimenting on farm. There's research trials. There's the Organic Farming Research Foundation. There's lots of good people, many universities doing good quality research about how to increase your productivity, reduce your inputs, et cetera. The challenge is the time of the day to get it all. And so the one-stop shop kind of things, I would assume that if you talk to, I guess Arizona State is your land grant here, or maybe it's University of Arizona. I would assume not that they are a great resource overall, but that you can probably find dedicated faculty there that usually even in the most conventional land grants, there's an entomologist or a soil scientist or an agronomist that is really into this. So you might be able to find some there. And then of course the other thing, most of us, if we're not watching YouTube, we're going to Sustainable Ag conferences to improve our skills as well. But I really think that the skill building thing and the peer learning is absolutely critical. But I also think that as farmers, and if you're not a farmer but you value food as an eater, in my book, I refer to the idea of food citizens. You know, we've got about 10 million people going to farmers markets every Saturday. Imagine if we harness them as a force to advocate for better public policy around local foods, sustainable farming, environment and livelihood. If we could mobilize those people into food citizens, that could also help us a great deal. I think I'm probably over time. I better quit.
Let's give him a round of applause.